following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
Welcome back to Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League. I'm Ricky Vellante, and I'll be joined by my co-host, David West, shortly. As usual, we'll be welcoming guests, challenging the status quo, doing social good, and bringing about positive change to the world, while also talking a little bit of sports. In this episode, we'll be joined by award-winning writer and journalist, Patrick Hruby. Patrick's contributed to a number of newspapers and magazines across the country, including the LA Times, Washington Post, ESPN.com, and others. We're going to get into Patrick's coverage comparing the health and safety regulations in college sports versus the NFL. We talk about the lawsuits the NCAA has recently faced, including the O'Bannon and Alston suits. And then we also look at how college and professional sports are doing in terms of making their product appealing to Gen Z. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. We hope you enjoy the episode. And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, my co-host David West. Today we're joined by another special guest, Patrick Hruby, contributor to a number of magazines and newspapers at this point, and actually also the author of the first piece ever covering, at the time, the HBL, now the PCL, and Vice Sports prior to it coming to its end in the summer of 2017. So Patrick, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. In fact, it was so long ago, it was the HBCU League, I believe. Even HBL hadn't been coined yet. So
That's right.
I feel like in some ways I was present at the creation. So if this goes great, I just want that tiny bit of credit. And if it goes terrible, I disavow any knowledge of your project, and I never spoke to any of you. I'm channeling the president's attitude towards everything right now.
Now that you mentioned it, I do remember it was still the HBCU League. We hadn't come up with a name yet. That came a few months later. So you were definitely there at the beginning. It was just Andy and I in our collective basements at that point.
I mean, I have to say, it has been amazing because I've checked in with you guys repeatedly over the years, watching this grow, watching people like David come aboard, watching the idea change, watching you guys go out and hustle and work to make this real. I feel like I have gotten, and I'm not even you guys, but just from the outside checking in, I feel like I've almost gotten like a business school education in some ways, watching this happen. And honestly, it's really incredible. Like I felt it's a great idea from the start, and I am unabashedly hoping that it works and it works out, and that you make something that makes a difference.
Well, that's certainly the goal, and we appreciate that. So we always like to let our guests introduce themselves a little bit to the audience. For those that may not be familiar with you, take us through, like I said, you've contributed to a number of incredible newspapers and magazines across the country. Take us through what got you into journalism and all the exciting things you're doing now.
So, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been a journalist for, oh my God, like basically 20 years, which is incredible to think about. I don't see myself as old, but I guess I am. And yeah, I mean, I kind of got into the sports journalism like a lot of people do. Like, sports were fun. They're intriguing. It seemed like a cool job to have. Like, it seemed like an interesting job. And it's like the whole like kind of beats working for a living sort of attitude. That seemed pretty interesting. But I have to say pretty quickly, I mean, really early in my career, like late 90s, early 2000s, I realized that sports were actually a great way to write about, learn about, and talk about everything else in society. That they were this incredible mirror to everything else happening in society, that they weren't like set off in the sports page on their own, but in fact, every economic, political, social issue that you could think of intersects with sport. It's taking place right now in sport, and taking place in ways that if you can understand it in sports, you can understand it in the bigger picture. And also you can kind of teach people about things they might otherwise not be interested in. Like, it's almost like sports was the spoon of sugar to get people to learn about something bigger. And I think, probably since about the mid-2000s, so maybe like the last 10, 15 years of my career, I've really focused on that kind of writing, that kind of reporting. That's what really interests me. For instance, like the NCAA, a topic near and dear to all of our hearts. If you understand what's happening really with the economy of the NCAA and of amateurism, you understand what's happening with consolidated private and corporate power in America and monopoly, and how changes to our antitrust law interpretation have actually affected our entire economy in a very profound and anti-labor way over a long time. And that could sound a little pretentious, but it's actually true. And it's the NCAA stuff is such a good window into that. And that's something that if you sat down and try and talk to someone about, their eyes will glaze over. They have no idea what you're talking about. They're probably not that interested. But all of a sudden, you bring it to like college sports, which is something they care about, and they'll listen and they'll learn something. And to me, that's really, really cool. And when I get a chance to do that as a journalist, I'm really excited. So to get back to your original question of like, how did I get into this and why? That in a nutshell is kind of my journey. I went from just sort of wanting to write about the games to writing about everything else around them. And honestly, like, I'm not interested in writing about like who wins and loses anymore or why. I think that's great. I think that's fun. And honestly, for me, when I watch a game or read about that, I'm doing that because I want to get away from thinking about all this other big stuff for a little bit to recharge my batteries, like a lot of people probably. But I wouldn't ever want to permanently do that. And the whole stick to sports idea, I think, is a mistake. And people are missing out on the chance to learn about so much more when they have that attitude.
Which sports do you tend to lean toward in terms of shaping stories and making those connections to the larger issues in society?
In my career, I think in the last decade especially, it's been college sports because of amateurism, but also a lot of the health and safety stuff, just labor exploitation in general, the education piece of it, where there's just a lot of there's a lot of majoring in eligibility and like bad and bogus educations being sold to people and given to people. It's just the way in which you have in college sports, you have this like very powerful system in place that really benefits the people at the top of it and is kind of exploiting everybody else involved in it. I mean, gee, what does that sound like? Does that remind us of anything? So I would say that. And then also, I focused a lot on the NFL for some of the same reasons, but especially I have focused a lot on the brain trauma issue in the NFL. And one of the things that really drew me into that was, it's going to sound really weird, so hang with me a minute, but my parents are both scientists. My mother is a retired physics professor and astronomy professor. My father is still an active research organic chemist, but like he's like a really like world-renowned researcher in his field. I once interned at his scientific journal for a summer, like handling manuscripts and stuff. I didn't know a word of what they were talking about, but I sort of grew up around the process of like how that all works, how research works, how science works. I grew up a lot of respect for that. To see what the NFL was doing with concussion research, how they were polluting it, how they were borrowing from big tobacco and these other industries where their product creates some sort of public harm. And instead of acknowledging that harm and paying for it and dealing with it, they try to like manufacture doubt. They try to create controversy. They run, like I said, they run the playbook the tobacco companies ran that now we have seen the energy companies run with climate change, that we see the soda companies run with sugar. I mean, just over and over, right? It's the same thing that happens. That drew me in. And I felt like if I could learn about and teach people about how it's happening in football, they might start to see how it's happening elsewhere. And obviously the goal of all that is like, we could do something about it. We can have better laws. We can stop this stuff from happening. We can actually make it so that harmful products are less harmful, or that we are taking care of the people that are harmed, or both. You know, ultimately, as a journalist, your goal is like when you write about this stuff, you hope that by informing people, it will spur them to action that makes a positive difference. I would say those are the two big sports that I've looked at. But God, David, you could look at anything, right? If you want to talk about like corruption, you could go look at FIFA, right? There's so much there you could talk about, right? Just sort of international financial corruption, right? Like if you want to understand the Panama Papers, go study FIFA. You understand both. If you want to look at race and gender, I mean, you could look at almost every sport. I mean, something I regret not covering more of in my career is just the amount of sexism that's out there in sports, and the lack of opportunity for female athletes, and the lack of opportunity for an investment in getting women's sports to a better and more equal place. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, there's also a huge like wasted business opportunity there. Like people aren't investing in something that could actually not only be socially positive, but like make people money in the future. People just taking a short-sighted view, right? It's kind of like how Hollywood for decades was like, oh, like we should like try to make make things that Black people would like, and then we could make money. Really? Oh wait, Tyler Perry. Like, what are you? Wow, this is amazing. What a formula. How did you figure this out? It's like you're just ignoring an entire market, right? Like it's kind of amazing. So I think with that, There's a lot there. I could talk all day about like what I wish I could be covering, but I mean, those are the two big ones for me. But I think anywhere you look in sports, you can find all this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, one of your best pieces, obviously your best piece was the story you wrote about us, but one of your other best ones, the Junction Boy Syndrome piece that you wrote about comparing college football to professional football. And it's certainly something we've been talking about with guests a lot lately in the context of the pandemic, where, if I'm remembering your numbers correctly, 37 football players have died since 2000, college football players, whereas only Corey Stringer has died in the NFL during that same period of time for training-related injuries or impact-related injuries.
So that's I want to just jump in because I think this is a really key thing for people to realize. An average of 2 college football players are dying every year over the last basically 2 decades. They're not dying from playing football on the field or even in practice. Football, a very violent sport where you would think like people are slamming into each other. They're really fast. They're really strong. The whole point of the game is like to out-violent the other guy, essentially. And no, these people are dying in workouts. It's not with their pads and their shoulders on. They're not hitting each other. They're literally dying because like idiot strength coaches are putting them through like insane, overzealous CrossFit routines and killing them or killing them from heat stroke. Like, these deaths are all 100% preventable. Not one of these people had to die. And instead of putting in rules with teeth, like the rules they have for amateurism and who can get money in college sports, with compliance officers and enforcement and penalties, rules just for how you do off-season practicing. Instead of doing that, the NCAA just puts out guidelines. The NCAA knows about this. The athletic trainers, like very good people within the system, like athletic trainers and doctors, have literally written position papers and given them to the NCAA and said, here are the rules you need. Here's what you should do. And the NCAA is like, cool, we're going to make some guidelines that have no teeth that we don't enforce because we don't want to be legally liable in any way if anything ever goes bad. It's really that simple. And it's gross. And you're right, they don't have that in the NFL. I think in part because the NFL has a players' union. And the union has power. And the players' union could say, no, we need these rules. Like, we're not going to just be ruled by individual coaches and crazy strength coaches doing whatever they want and hoping they get away with it. Like, we're not going to do that. And so there's a huge difference there between the two sports. And it does speak to how in college sports, there needs to be more of a power balance between the athletes / labor and the schools, athletic department / management. Anywhere you look in society, anywhere you look in human history, you don't have that balance, you end up with exploitation, harm, death in the worst case scenarios, and something where things get stuck, they don't change. They're not able to change quickly when when Corey Stringer died, right? The NFL, they changed pretty quickly. They adopted those new rules pretty quickly. Like, I'm very critical of a lot of health and safety stuff in the NFL. It's very relative, and there's a lot of stuff that's not good in that league when it comes to protecting the athletes. But at least on that front, with heat stroke, they've done the right thing and they've seen better results. And it's completely doable. The fact that I don't mean to laugh, but the fact that that's 20 years on and college football still doesn't have that. And someone like Jordan McNair here in my backyard at the University of Maryland is dying of heat stroke during practice is inexcusable and unforgivable.
The NBA, when Jason Collier died in his sleep in 2006, and it was literally the next month. It was about a month and a half before training camp. It became mandatory that we had to get the cardio.
Right.
Screening. So my first 3 years, there was no cardiovascular screening at all. And then literally the incident happened with Collier. He lost his life and the NBA went in a complete other direction. We were on that treadmill, 1,000 patches, and it was like, it all of a sudden it became a big deal because it was like, you can't even step on the floor and start training camp unless you take this test. So you've seen organizations historically change course, when they need to. And again, the NCAA has been slow to do so.
And I'm glad you brought that up because that's the thing is like sometimes people can be goodwill, good meaning, and something bad happens, and then everyone realizes, okay, wow, we have to put in different rules, different precautions, we have to make some changes. And unfortunately, something really bad happened first. You'd like it that you always can see ahead of that, right? and that you could put things in place so that you never have a death or something tragic in the first place. But at least, like with your example of the NBA, they were able to quickly adjust to make it safer for people. And that's what is so crazy about the NCAA, is that they've known for a long time. They have people, their own experts, telling them what to do, and they just won't put in actual rules because it's too expensive, inconvenient, and legally risky. And when the NCAA goes into court and says, we're not legally liable for the health and safety of athletes, I mean, what else do you need to know about them? Right. You don't need anything else about their priorities. And that's just, it's really a shame. Again, I'm here in Washington, D.C. It's something I've been to a lot. I've either been to, or now that we're in the pandemic, I've been following a lot of the hearings they've had this year about the name, image, and likeness potential legislation, right? But you see a lot of Congress people talking about this topic now. And that's a relief, because I haven't been talking about before. I'm just hopeful that maybe some of that congressional pressure will lead to changes. I don't know. I'm not that confident. It seems like when the NCAA makes changes, like David, the story you just told me, the NBA didn't get sued to do that, right? They just made that change.
Right.
In the NCAA, for instance, they do have mandatory sickle cell trait testing, which has worked, which has helped prevent some athletes from dying during workouts because of having that. I don't want to get all the complicated science of how that works, but essentially, African Americans are more likely to have sickle cell trait. If you have that trait, some white people have it too. So nobody out there get confused. If you have that trait, there's some precautions you should be taking during your workouts just to avoid, like, worst case, like things can happen in your blood that can really damage or kill you. But you totally can still be an athlete and still do it safely. You just need to do some different precautions. NCAA knew about this. Athletes were dying, didn't do anything. They got sued. I've talked to the lawyer that was on this case about it. And the settlement of that lawsuit, they finally decided to adopt a rule where, like, all the athletes would at least be screened for this trait. It took a lawsuit. It took a gun to their head legally.
Right.
It shouldn't have to do that. It should work the way it did in the NBA, where, like, you see a problem, you move quickly to try and solve it as responsibly as you can.
Yeah, I remember the sickle cell posters in the athletic training offices of the two schools that I was at, and you did have that test in place. You touched on sort of the window that sports can provide into these things. And as you continue to describe these things, I mean, it really sounds like some of the monopolies that were in power at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, which also took major legislation and lawsuits to ultimately break up. But I guess I say that in the way that, how is it possible that we have this monopoly that exists when we have the Sherman Antitrust Act, we have the Clayton Antitrust Act, we've broken up trusts and monopolies before, that under the nose of Congress, this massive, we're now up to like $14 to $15 billion in revenue a year, depending on who you ask. I mean, how can this thing still exist this way? And I also, the part one and part two, we've been only talking about the NCAA in sort of a broader context, and it being this all powerful entity, but it is a membership association.
Right. The NCAA is the schools.
Which I think oftentimes gets over, Mark Emmert is there to take the bullets for the school, much like Goodell is there to take the bullets for the NFL owners.
Right.
Emmert is there to take that heat, when in reality, if Clemson and Alabama and Duke and UNC and all these powerhouse schools in basketball and football came together and said, we're going to make it better for our athletes, they could do it tomorrow if they wanted.
They absolutely could. Yeah, no, Mark Emmert is an Indianapolis-based cartel leader, but it's still a cartel. And all those schools, they're like all the crime families, right? You're right. They don't. And the thing that's funny is, like, the schools don't trust each other. I mean, so many of those rules are in place because they don't trust each other. They don't want each other to get, like, recruiting advantages, blah blah blah, right? But what is amazing is, if they wanted to change, they could. And there's kind of this shell game they play of responsibility, where the NCAA will be like, we're just a membership organization. We can't do anything our schools won't tell us to do. And this individual schools would be like, well, sure, it'd be nice to do X, Y, or Z. That's better. But, our hands are tied because there's NCAA is telling us we can't do that. So it's like I said, it's a really nice one of those things where, like, they both get what they want out of it. They both get to play the Roger Goodell role at times and take the bullets and pretend they're helpless. But, your other question about how is it possible in 2020 that this is allowed to take place? How are we allowing this, like, very obvious monopoly / cartel to do all the things it's doing? I think there's a couple of reasons, and I'd be curious to see what you guys think. I mean, I think, first of all, the most immediate reason is that in the last decade, we've seen the NCAA, through a ban and other suits, get challenged for once in antitrust court. Previously in history, when people tried to sue the NCAA for these reasons, judges just threw it out. Judges were like, whatever, like, we like college sports, get out of my court. Amateurism's awesome. Literally, they're like citing like the ancient Greek ideals of amateurism, which, by the way, there's no such thing, but that's a different podcast. When it finally got into court and was tested for the first time in the O'Bannon trial, and since then, the NCAA's arguments have basically all been losers. Again, without getting into all the legal record, you can go back. Anyone out there can go look at this. They just haven't done a good job. But the judges, I think, have been afraid to press the red button, because what the NCAA has successfully done in court is basically make a meta argument, which is, if you make us change, then all the stuff you like about college sports is going to go away. It's going to be terrible. And they always run out of parade of horribles. Ohio State's going to drop to Division III. Every Olympic sport's going to get cut. We're not going to be able to afford anything because the bidding war is going to be so high for these athletes. There's just, it's just like, it's going to be like, dogs and cats living together, right? The whole Ghostbusters thing with Bill Murray. It's going to be the apocalypse. Like, obviously, I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any evidence for that. But I think they're able to scare the judges enough that the judges are kind of like, okay, well, we find that you're breaking antitrust law, but the remedy is for you not to really change. I don't know how long that'll keep going, but that's kind of the state of play right now. So I think there's like that judicial just reluctance to like get involved. I think historically in the United States, in that broader picture, our laws, our courts, our government have always given sports this very wide range of deference that we don't give other industries. It's kind of weird. There's a lot of cultural reasons for it. But in general, we're much more hands-off. Like, we don't have a Ministry of Sport in the United States like many other nations do, right? We just kind of leave sports to be this unregulated place. So I think that's part of it. I think there's definitely a racial element to it. If the athletes in the primarily, in the revenue sports, so to speak, if they were all white and everybody in charge of the system was black and all the money was mostly flowing from white labor to black management, there's absolutely no way, in my opinion, that this system would have lasted as long as it did, or even be started. Now, in fairness to the NCAA, when they started amateurism in the system, our country was like way more segregated. All these schools were segregated, so it wasn't designed to take wealth from black labor. But that's been I say it sarcastically, a happy byproduct for the people who are in charge. And I just think, if the shoe was on the other foot, it would have been gotten rid of a long time ago. And I also think that the mythology around amateurism was really, really powerful until recently. I think if you talk to older people, like, they think there's something, you ask them like, well, what if college athletes were paid or allowed to be paid or whatever? And they'll always be like, there's something I don't know about that. It's dirty. There's something wrong about that. They can't really tell you why they think that. They just do. It's almost like they viscerally associate it with something bad. That's the power of like values and mythology and belief. And that was just sort of in the atmosphere for decades, right? And I think it's only in the last 10, 15 years that that's really changed, because if you talk to anybody at 30 or under, they're just like, it doesn't make any sense that college athletes can't earn what they're worth. And there's nothing dirty or wrong about making money if you're a college athlete. So I think that's changed. But for older people who are in charge of things, they still have some of the vestiges of that feeling. So I think if you add all that up, that's why the NCAA has been able to successfully keep the status quo mostly where it is.
Yeah, I think back to Wilken's opinion in the Alston case. If you were just to, I think if I recall, it was like a 65 or 67 page opinion, whatever it was. Let's say it was 67. If you only read the first 65 pages, right, you would think the NCAA was done. Like, right. she killed it. Yeah. Except that in the last 2 pages, she's like, all right, now after I've said all these awful evils about the NCAA and why all of their arguments are loser arguments and why it should not continue to have this monopolistic power that it enjoys, I'm just going to slap them on the wrist. She
also said, I'm going to slap you on the wrist, but you should really go to Congress and get together with Congress and get together with the college athletes and get together with their lawyers. And you should figure something out, because in the future, myself or some other judge may not be as nice to you. It was basically like she pulled them over. They were going like 160 mile per hour in a 45 mile per hour zone. The NCAA said to them, how fast are you going? The NCAA is like, I don't know, 30 miles an hour? And she's like, no, you were going 165. And it's like, I'm not going to write you a ticket or arrest you right now, but I want you to go like have a meeting like a traffic school. Right. And promise that you'll never do this again. It's just like, it's crazy, right? It's just kind of like the most lenient policing that we've seen. David, I'm actually curious, when you were a great college player. I remember watching you. You're fantastic. You had an incredible NBA career. From the inside, from the player perspective, How have you seen people's attitudes about this shift from when you were a college player to all the way now with your involvement with PCL? Have you seen a big change in sort of how people look at that idea of amateurism and what college athletes are worth, and should they be allowed to have rights? And even people looking at it as a matter of rights versus, oh, these college athletes have it great and they're just being whiny. You know what I'm saying? Like, how much have you seen public opinion change over the years?
We didn't hear about it much when, like, when I was in college and playing. It wasn't a big deal because we didn't necessarily have a whole lot of privileges. Like,
right.
We flew commercial, flew coach. We didn't have there weren't a whole lot of amenities, I would say. And we knew that there were instances where, like, one guy, like one star recruit, maybe got some money or something, got some benefits. But for the most part, like, I don't know how prevalent it was for guys to be thinking about being paid while you're in college.
Right.
But then for me, and I think for a lot of guys at the pro level, it was in the early 2000s when they started signing these massive TV contracts.
Right.
Like, that's when all of a sudden we knew, at least the light bulb went off for me, like, oh, that's different now. Like, there wasn't, the Atlantic 10 didn't have a $1 billion TV deal, didn't have its own network. None of the schools did. And then all of a sudden these networks, and then, you're like, wait a minute, wait. That's when things started to really flip for me. It was with the TV contracts, and being in the NBA and having gone through a labor dispute in the NBA, knowing the value of the TV contracts and knowing what they meant for the NBA business. I'm like, wait a minute, the NCAA is doing the same thing, and the guys aren't getting any money. That's so that's where my whole attitude shifted, and that's where I've seen the biggest change. It's come with the numbers now. Like, for a while there, we're seeing every couple weeks, right, multi-billion-dollar deal with university, a multi-billion-dollar deal with some shoe company or some sort of massive branding opportunity, national TV opportunity. And you're saying, wait a minute, now I know a lot of folks are being compensated, and the guys, the players who are actually producing the whole market, they're not managing it. And because they're not managing it, they're not allowed to participate in any of the benefits, outside of just being on TV and having some regional celebrity associated with their university.
Right. I think what I hear you saying is almost the idea of, like, there's almost like a two-step process here. Like, you have to realize, that you are in fact labor, right? Like, yeah, you're playing a game, and, like, most players, I think they love the game they want to play. Like, that's a huge part of their identity and what they enjoy. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? A lot of us also have, like, I love my job. A huge part of my identity is put up with it. It doesn't mean that, like, I shouldn't be compensated for the labor part of it too, right? Both those things can exist at the same time. So I think part of how this has all changed is, like, both for the athletes themselves, like in your case, David, and also for people, everyone around the sports, have come to realize and accept that, college athletics is labor, right? And then the second part, you mentioned the money. It's like, oh, this is also really valuable labor, right? It's generating a lot of value. And, in the last 20 years, the money has shot up so much. I think for everyone in society, again, why are younger people so much more open to this? Because that's the world they've always lived in, right? They don't remember a time where the money was relatively small and the opportunities are relatively small. Like, they only know the modern era where it's like big TV deals, big shoe contracts. Everyone is their own brand on Instagram, right? Like, we live in just such an incredibly hyper commercial society, for good and bad. But college sports are a huge part of it, and I think people are more just accepting that that's how it is. And it's really important too. Like, I wonder too. I think my impression from talking to athletes over the years, right, talking to college athletes over the years, was always two things: talking to a freshman or a sophomore versus a junior or senior about this stuff. There was always a big difference. By the time, men and women, by the time they had kind of gone through college sports for a couple of years, and they had gone from sort of just focusing on, like, I'm just trying to grow up and I'm trying to be good at my sport and I'm trying to pass my classes and have fun at school and I'm just worried about me, to, like, you get to the end of it and you're like, oh, I'm thinking about the bigger picture. I've seen stuff. I've started to think about how the system works. Right. And also, I feel like because there's so much more stuff about this in the press now and the media and out there, if you want to learn about it, you can. I feel like athletes have gotten a lot more sort of informed. and have their consciousness sort of raised about all this more broadly than they did 15, 20 years ago. And it's happening younger, right? So they're coming in as freshmen and they already know this stuff, as opposed to like they go through the system and then they kind of realize it. And by the time they really realize that, they're already out and it's sort of too late to do anything about it. Do you get that sense too?
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely see it. Families are a lot more aware. I remember I think it was Wendell Carter, his mom was probably the first parent that was really vocal. I mean, even though she sent him to Duke, she was still very vocal about the fact that she's committing her son to a system that's going to exploit him. And I think there were a few parents that subsequently, came out publicly along the same line. So you definitely see people, understanding the nature of the NCAA now. I just think that, when you're talking about the impact, particularly economically, that, these opportunities present for all of the families involved that are non-player families, all of the people that are employed, people that are given, career opportunities, and for the players to not share in that. Again, it gets tricky because we often see, right, the freshmen, and they have a different idea. Like you said, they're still sort of drunk on the nostalgia of getting to college and getting a scholarship. And, you've got juniors and seniors who've been through the storm and are like, look, man, this, and if they had other options or could do it over again, they would have clearly made different choices. But the nature of what, what the NCAA is and what, the system that these schools sort of prop up and abide by has changed in a way that, again, I think it's going to be hard, particularly after whatever they try to put together for this year. I think the stories are going to be incredibly harsh, simply because I think now there's no longer questioning what the motive is. Right?
No, it's not. You can't anymore. It's like, we need the money. We're doing this for the money.
Right.
Like, we're going to get that money. Like, look at all the people that depend on this money. I mean, if there's nothing that if there's one thing everyone already knew, but it's been made crystal clear.
Right.
It's, this whole system, this lucrative system, depends on this labor. It depends on these games happening.
Right.
And we're doing, like, right now, you see college football, they're doing everything they can. I mean, like, college football's canceling games left and right. People are getting infected. People are getting affected at like summer workouts. They just plowed through. They just plowed through. And like the leagues, the Big Ten and Pac-12, when they were like, we're going to wait, they went back on that.
Right.
And again, I'm not trying to make light of like the medical considerations or anything. Like, I don't think everyone in the system is like terribly intended. I think they're like, much like, again, talk about a mirror society. The universities that these teams are a part of are also really struggling with this virus, like, understandably. And they have the same cross pressures, right? They're trying to keep their students safe. They're also trying to keep the universities from staying solvent. Like, there's a lot of issues there. And like, so I just want to say, even though I could point at a lot of stuff and be like, I think you're being reckless here, I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of cross pressure here.
Right.
And not everyone that is doing stuff that absolutely doesn't work is necessarily being irresponsible with it. But both of those cases, we are seeing, money is actually really important. And it's a huge part of why this is happening. And it does, and again, it makes it more clear, how can you deny the people who are generating the money?
Right.
More power, more say, a fairer share.
Right.
The craziest part on the economic side is that by maintaining the status quo that they've maintained, number one, they cut off access to what could be very lucrative areas of additional revenues. So when you talk about league licensing versus individual player licensing, the NCAA and its university members outpace every single professional league in the country on team and league-based revenue. But then they are dead last when it comes to individual licensing, because they know that if they were to take advantage of that revenue opportunity, it removes some of the very thinly veiled elements that these are really employees. They're not just student athletes like they claim that they are. And that number in 2004 was deemed to be over $1 billion a year that the NCAA was leaving on the table. And as we've talked about here since 2004, these evaluations
is like you triple, quadruple, quintuple.
Right. So number one, the pie could get a whole lot bigger if they wanted. But number two, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, Patrick, it's also now creating a disconnect with the Gen Z fans, which is such a critical piece
Right.
for any sports league going forward, that because you don't have the players themselves who now we've reached a point where Gen Zers are in college, because they don't have that connectivity with the individuals that are playing the games. Again, they're losing out on viewers now as a result of this.
I'm glad you brought this up. So there was, I want to explain this to people listening, because it's also something I was thinking about writing about this week. I haven't had time yet, but I just want to talk it through with you guys, because I think I think it actually speaks to an opportunity for leagues like yours, but B, it speaks to a real short-sightedness from a pure business perspective on the part of the colleges and the NCAA. So this poll of sports fans, it found that Gen Z, so basically your next generation of fans after the millennials, right? Your future customers, if you are the NCAA or college sports, right? And if you're any league, they are in general less enthusiastic. They're watching less sports. But it was particularly true, and this is compared to millennials and the population as a whole. Mm-hmm. This comparison was particularly true for college football. It was something like 10 or 12 points less. College. I bring up college football because that was the sport that they measured in college, but also college football is the biggest college sport, the biggest moneymaker, right? So I think it's fair for them to measure that one. So think about this, like, and the whole story to go along with this polling, they talked to some marketing experts who work in sports at the NHL and the NBA, and they kept saying over and over, the way you connect with Gen Z fans, the way you make Gen Z people become sports fans is not so much through teams and the name on the front of the jersey, it's the name on the back of the jersey, and it's through personalities. This makes sense. It's through like Instagram and TikTok and Twitter. It's basically, I mean, this is, by the way, another thing they found in this poll is that these Gen Zers were way more into like video game players, like on Twitch, right? Well, again, this all makes sense, right? That's how they sort of get excited about and connect to people, is through all these different types of social media. Yeah. And they also really relate and like people who they can feel that connection with. And so it's kind of crazy that college sports isn't actually taking advantage of that. Because if you think about it, who are the athletes in college sports? They're the peers. They are Gen Z guys. These are men and women, young men and women in college sports who naturally, like, it's not like me trying to go on a TikTok and be like, hello, fellow kids. Like, these are the fellow kids. Like, college sports could be engaging with and building its future fan base here and doing some really smart business things by empowering and encouraging these young athletes to get out there on social media, to get out there and build their personal brands, to get out there and be engaging. But that would require two things that they don't like, that they would require them, probably to, like, you guys can capitalize on your name, image, and likeness. Go ahead and make money on it. Like, you remember that kicker at the University of Central Florida?
De La Haye?
Yeah, who became really popular because he was just engaging. I mean, think about this. A kicker at the University of Central Florida became a YouTube star. That's incredible, right? And had to shut it down because the NCAA was like, you can't make money off of this, right? The NCAA is costing itself future fan base by doing that. They're also costing themselves future fan base by being so controlling of what athletes can and can't say. I mean, David, I'm sure you remember this from your time at Xavier, but like, stuff has not changed. When I was an undergrad at Georgetown in the 90s, it was famous for Hoya paranoia, and their sports athletic department like really controlled the access to the players, what they could say. I mean, you just basically couldn't get to know these guys, and they were like just cloistered off. Like, and I understand these schools want to protect them in some ways they want to protect themselves if someone says something controversial. I mean, in some ways, they feel like it's good business to like message control, right? They're thinking like a corporation. But if you do that, and you do that to the extent they do in the NCAA, again, you are denying these athletes the chance to connect with all these other future fans.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of like, you're killing your own seed corn here. In the short term, I feel like they feel like, well, if we control NILs and we control the athletes being able to talk, we're like helping our business. But in the long term, I would argue, no, you're actually killing your business.
I think the other most, if I recall correctly, I think Major League Baseball was the other biggest drop-off from Gen Z to the general population, which, to confirm your thesis, makes so much sense because Major League Baseball, the unwritten rules of the game, the traditional nature of the game, they don't like guys having personality. So you end up, Bryce Harper and Tatis and Guerrero and all these guys who have flair and have personality. Right. Every time they sort of step out ever so slightly, they get beat up by their member players and the media and everybody else saying that, you're violating the unwritten rules. So it ends up stunting, Major League Baseball's average age of their viewer is going up faster than the years are passing. Right. So again, short-sightedness in terms of their product. And by the way, David, this is something I'm sure you'll be happy to hear, but the NBA is like the one exception to this in that same polling. The NBA is outperforming the other leagues among Gen Z. And again, the people that are the experts that study this, that actually work in those leagues, will tell you it's because the NBA, at least in the last 10 years, has done the opposite. They've embraced having players, be involved with people, be on social media. Kevin Durant, go have your burner account. That's actually good for us. Like when people get mad about that, that's even good for us.
Yeah, I remember when it first started. There were a lot of older guys who were pushing against it, and then in player meetings, the NBA was like, "No, we actually want to encourage you guys to be more active, to have because this was, like I said, mid 2000s." And so the thing was, we were coming out of the Malice in the Palace.
Right. Dress code.
Right. The NBA used social media as a way for people to get a look at players in a different way. And it worked. And I think there was stats saying that, the NBA was one of the most active, if not the most active player base in the social media world, and had the guys who were more interactive with their fans and things like that. And it's absolutely helped their game. Even though I will say, though, I think what we're dealing with, though, ultimately is like just a different type of kid, right? Like kids just aren't in the sports. Like
you're right about that too. There are more reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
There are more reasons than just the ones we're talking about, for sure. It's a broader issue for sports, and trying to connect to Gen Z, it's a broader thing. And like some of it is also like they just consume all media in different ways. Like they're not going to watch TV. They're not going to sit down and watch a game for 2 hours. They're not going to watch anything for 2 hours.
No way.
But at least you want what you want, at least. But that's even makes it more important than like, maybe I'm not going to watch a full college football game, but I love this quarterback. This guy is hilarious. I love watching. You know what? I love watching him play NCAA football on Twitch. Like I'm going to go watch him do that. But that's a way to bring people into your sport. It still makes sense. I think the NBA again has totally embraced that. Look at what they do with the NBA 2K video game. Like, they're like investing in having teams and putting it out there on Twitch. And like, I doubt they're making money with that right now, but they're forward thinking. Right. They are looking at, that's where our future fans are now. Right. At least let's get in front of them. Let's give them a chance to fall in love with this product. Let's give them a chance to feel good about it. Maybe they're never going to be a fan of LeBron James, but maybe there's some pro NBA 2K player who they do become a fan of. And at some point that translates into them buying that licensed game of ours, or buying a jersey, or they actually tune in to watch the real thing and they fall in love with that too. You're just giving people more access and more reasons to like your product, which is just smart business.
Right. Yeah, Josh Hart's cut out a nice little fan base for himself just because he's such an active video game guy. I mean, he's almost got more fans because of what he's doing on Xbox than what he's doing on the court. You know, Donovan Mitchell, granted, Donovan Mitchell's like a top 15 player in the league, but he's the same way. You know, he's very, very active on social media and in the esports space. So I think that it's very interesting to watch this continued growth of the league.
And I think there's one piece here too for the college athletes that actually could be good in an educational way. Now, hear me out. Maybe this is crazy. So, David, if I sound like an idiot, jump in and tell me, especially having been a college athlete yourself. But I think also, I've always felt like the way these sports information departments and athletic departments like hide athletes and control their access so much to the media and to the public is doing them a disservice in terms of giving them a chance to actually learn and grow. And what I mean is, I mean this sincerely, like, if you're a college athlete, if you're an 18, 19-year-old young person, and you say something stupid on Twitter, or you say something controversial in an interview, or you have like a bad take, or you're still growing and learning, you have some opinions that people don't like, or maybe are kind of bad opinions. It can be actually helpful and useful to your personal growth for those to get out in the world, to get negative feedback, to have to learn something, to have to respond, not just learn how to talk or learn how to be boring in public, but literally learn a lesson. Like, it's just like if you're around your friends and you're like a jerk and they're like, dude, what are you doing? Right? That actually helps you become a better person most of the time. Right. From feedback, not always positive feedback, right? Sometimes your coach pats you in the back and sometimes they yell at you. So sometimes you need both. I actually think that letting athletes be free at the college level to engage with the public more and letting them actually be able to make some mistakes like that. Yes, it's going to be a headache for the coach or the sports information person when they get that call, like at 2 a.m. So-and-so tweeted this bad idea. Now we're going to have to like talk about it to the media tomorrow. Right. That's fine. That's a headache, but it's a chance for them to actually learn something. And I think we're kind of denying that. And maybe we shouldn't be, just from a purely educational standpoint. Do you think there's truth to that, or am I being too optimistic?
No, I think there's some validity in that. You know, I definitely think that we're in a weird space in a different time, and I think we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that, you know, what was acceptable. Again, so I had Coach Prosser my first couple years at Xavier. So he was an equal opportunity bitcher. That was his thing. I'm gonna bitch at everybody, right? Nobody's gonna get a pass. And I remember knowing that certain guys couldn't take coach. Like, I could take it. Like, my dad was in the military, so I was used to getting hit upside the head, getting yelled at or whatever. But some guys, that they didn't respond to it.
Right.
And so they retreated into themselves instead of it being an opportunity for them to learn, grow, mature, and get better. So I think now, you know, with the nature of the athlete, right, all of those every option has to be on the table when it comes to connecting with the athlete, but then also giving the athlete the space to make mistakes, because the other part of it is traditionally coaches don't want to give guys the room to make mistakes because they assume that they're all going to make mistakes. So it's like, I'm not going to let them out of my to make the mistakes that I know they're going to make. And actually, we've heard and we know that that's legitimately the argument that they made to the players to keep them on campus during this coronavirus stuff, right? And like, there's no safer place for you to be than in my care, right? There's no better place for you right now in terms of your growth or whatever, and your safety, you know, is under my watch. And a lot of the guys, particularly the football players, bought into that early when they were like voluntarily coming back to campus.
Voluntary workouts, right?
Yeah, voluntarily coming back to campus, right? Again, I think you have to have all the options on the table, but it's definitely a valid point, because players have to be reached and they have to go through these moments where they can grow. And if they aren't allowed to go through the moments early, and I take this model as a youth basketball coach, right? I've got a group of 11-year-olds now, 11 and 12-year-olds. I want them to go through the fire now rather than later, right? So you want them to get the mistakes out and get the crying and the feeling of, oh my God, we lost, so I'm going to cry my eyes out. We get rid of that stuff now so that, you know, we're 13, 14, 15, we're in the serious thick of it, and we're really turning the corner. So I do believe that there is room, that there is a time and a place where you have to allow guys to make mistakes. Because you know, if they aren't making the mistakes in college where they can actually correct them, if you make a mistake like that when you're in the pros, that might be your only opportunity to make a mistake, and your career takes a bad turn.
I think you're right. I also think that if you allow more people to be free to express themselves, to interact, and to make those mistakes, I think over time you create a climate where we are all sort of more permissive. I don't want to say of mistakes, but we're more open to the idea of people can learn from mistakes and grow from them, and not like, you know, there's going to be a pile-on, but not necessarily a fatal pile-on sometimes. That would be good for our culture as a whole, right? So I mean, like, the opportunity of like, you've screwed up and people are mad, but it doesn't have to be that way forever. It doesn't be the end of a story.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a somewhat silly example, but David, I remember in particular you mentioning, I think it was a rookie who made the mistake of saying something bad about Beyonce, and you guys had to like pull him aside and be like, no.
You don't publicly criticize Beyonce, right? Perfect.
Like, if you ever want to go on social media again, we got to pull you to the side. Like, you know, if a pro makes that mistake, like, social media monetization is now a very legitimate piece of revenue for an athlete, but not having that experience at the collegiate level to make mistakes that may be a little more forgivable. Like once you do that, then the Bayhive is coming after you. And
right. It's the same thing on the court, but it's true. Like also, like I mean, David, maybe I'm way off base with this. My observation from being outside basketball, just someone who's like reported on and watched it, is I've always felt it always seems like the college coaches are much more controlling and terrified of their players making mistakes and programs. That's probably because they're younger and less experienced players, and so they make more. But and on the whole, I mean, the NBA is like these guys are the best of the best.
Yeah.
I assume everybody in the NBA is like a basketball genius too. So I mean,
and there's also a very paternalistic.
Yes, that's what I was trying to get at.
In college, so it's like this is your dad or father figure, and that's a major part of their shtick. You know what I mean?
Right.
That doesn't necessarily exist in the NBA. That dynamic. You're not necessarily looking to your coach in the NBA as a father figure, or even as an authority figure, right? As an adult person, this person is in a position of leadership in your job,
right?
So certain level,
or like the office manager,
right.
That makes sense.
One quick question. So I believe in everyone we've had on this show. I would use the word success. They've had varying levels of success, and I believe that in order to be successful, I think that humans by nature have to be in routines. And so I try to get a sense of what people do in the morning. What's your morning routine? Like, what's the first thing that you wake up and do, or how do you set your morning that leads you on to your day?
So first of all, I agree with you, like that routines are really important for success. I mean, I think there's maybe it was Aristotle, I don't know, but like the whole idea of like we are what you repetitively do.
Right.
I think that's very true. I mean, look, like one thing that's cool about being a sports fan is you see that really early. You see it often. I mean, it's literally like people get good at sports by like repeatedly practicing the same things over and over, right? And that's like a pretty good lesson for a lot of stuff in life.
Right.
You learn almost anything. It's just by doing stuff over and over, trial and error. You make those mistakes. You figure out what works better. You keep applying it, and you try to get it to where it becomes a habit. First of all, without answering your question, I just want to say I agree with you there. I don't know if my morning routine really contributes that much to what we talked about. I mean, like, I get up, like, I make some tea and coffee. My wife and I sip that in bed. Like, we look at the headlines. Like, I probably go to Twitter pretty early. That's definitely not a habit for success I'd recommend for anybody, but it's fun. I'm very much like, I'm more of an afternoon and evening person than a morning person.
Okay.
The morning is all about like, just like, you ever boot up your computer and maybe you have an older computer and the little wheel is just spinning for a while and you're like, is this thing ever going to turn on? That's kind of me in the morning. Like, my success habits are more in the rest of the day.
Okay. All right.
But I do have a pretty, like, I am a person of habit. I try to exercise every day, every other day. Like, I try to stick to routines with that. In terms of writing and reporting and talking to people, if anything, I'm one of those people, like, I overschedule what I'm trying to get done every day. Like, I have a spreadsheet of here's all the things I'm working on. And then each day I have like a spreadsheet for that day. And I put down all the things I want to get done that day, or I have appointments for that day. And I always put too much. I never get to it all. But I've found over time that that's been helpful because it's sort of, A, you figure time with things being productive. And B, it's better to have almost too much to get done than not have enough. Right? Like, you've ended up at the end of the week, it's like, wow, at the end of the week, first I'm like, wow, look at all the stuff I didn't get done this week.
Right.
But then, like, maybe a day later, like, let's say like Saturday evening, I'm like, wow, I got a lot done this week. That was pretty good.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's a helpful habit. But yeah, I wish I could tell you I was one of those morning guys. But honestly, this is how much of a non-morning guy I am. In like sophomore year of high school, like basketball tryouts were like at 6:30 a.m. And like, I couldn't do it. Like, because my body won't turn on at that time. Like, I was 10 times worse at basketball at 6:30 in the morning than if they had been at 6:30 in the afternoon.
Wow.
Like, I'm just slow. I feel like barfing. Like, I'm dizzy. Like, I'm just not a morning guy. So
right, I got you.
No amount of caffeine
I got you.
can take me to like level 10. It takes me from like level -5 to like a 3.
I got you.
To defend David's thesis, though, you do still have technically a morning routine that prepares you for the afternoon and the evening.
Right.
I actually am so jealous of morning people because they totally run the world.
Yeah,
they have such a competitive advantage over everybody else. The people that get up like at 5 a.m., like I already did my workout and I already knocked out all my emails and everything. And it's like, it's 9 o'clock. It's like, yeah, like you win. Like I'm going to be playing catch up the rest of the day. And it's not, I have to admit, it's not like I'm not like staying up to 2 a.m. catching up there either. So,
right.
Like I'm an afternoon person, but I'm not necessarily a night owl.
All right, gotcha.
Well, Patrick, we really appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, guys. Anytime.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League, featuring Patrick Hruby. Forward Thinking is co-hosted by David West and Ricky Vellante, produced by Wendell Haskins, Rafa Hernandez Brito, and Ricky Vellante, and the music is by David West. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. We'll see y'all next week, and in the meantime, stay safe.